The following clip is part of our APUSH study program. For more study materials, go to opaeducation.com and sign up now. The road to World War II started in the 1920s. During the 1920s, the United States had a relatively isolationist foreign policy. In 1928, the US and 62 other countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war. Geniuses, real geniuses. This pact did nothing. Next, FDR's good neighbor policy, aimed at changing the US's relationship with its Western Hemisphere neighbors, focused on trade and cooperation rather than intervention. For example, FDR changed the Platt Amendment with Cuba. The rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, and the expanding Japanese empire threatened America's isolationism. Debates between isolationists and interventionists were reignited as war broke out in Europe. The US used the cash and carry policy to send weapons to the British on British ships so as not to risk American lives. But as the Nazis began conquering Europe, more and more Americans began supporting intervention. But war would come to them with the attacks on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Soon after, the US entered the war. Mobilizing the military and economy to fight World War II helped bring the US out of the Great Depression and would help the US win the war as well. The United States enacted multiple policies to ensure the success of the war effort. First, goods like food and gas were rationed. Second, the U.S. began selling war bonds, which were basically loans from people to the government. Third, FDR created the War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization to coordinate and organize private industry. Fourth, FDR created the Selective Service and drafted Americans into the military. Socially, the war provided more opportunities for women and African Americans. Because there was a shortage of labor, women began to work in factories and take jobs typically given to men. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of women empowerment. As African Americans gained more influence in industry and in the military, they fought back against discrimination. In addition, the war helped draw attention to the dangers of fascism and racism at home and abroad. During the war, migration to the United States from Mexico increased, and Mexican workers helped the U.S. war effort. But the war had a significant negative effect for Japanese Americans. Through executive order, FDR forced 100,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. FDR and the Supreme Court believed that Japanese Americans were a national security threat and used that fear to justify discrimination, civil liberty revocal, and terrible treatment of Japanese Americans. By the time Congress declared war, the world was in shambles. France was cowering with their cheese and baguettes. In December of 1941, there was no guarantee the Allies would win at all. Hitler had begun his invasion of Russia. As the U.S. looked around, the only country it could really count on was Britain. But Britain was being bombarded nightly by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And Japan was in full force in the Pacific. This formed the basis of the Big Three: Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and FDR. Americans believed in the fight. They saw it as a struggle between the forces of democracy and freedom over the forces of totalitarianism and militarism. Soon after the U.S. joined the war effort in full force, the Allies saw three major wins that marked the turning points in the war. In northern Africa, the Battle of El Alamein marked the first Allied win in the battle against the Axis powers. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway was a U.S. win over Japan. This win re-established U.S. control over the fight and pushed the Japanese into retreat mode. But most importantly, the Russian win over Germany at Stalingrad pushed the Germans back on the Eastern Front. In the Pacific theater, the U.S. used the method of island hopping, which involved going from island to island in the Pacific and driving out Japanese forces. By July of 1943, Allied forces had pushed the Axis out of Africa entirely and began moving into Sicily and Italy. In 1943, as war raged, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill met in Tehran, Iran. At the conference, they planned D-Day. Stalin promised to declare war on Japan after defeating the Germans, and they outlined what would eventually become the United Nations. In June of 1944, the most important day of the war occurred. The Allied invasion of Normandy, also known as D-Day, was a successful landing of Allied troops in northern France. This opened up a Western front, and with the help of the Russians in the east, Berlin was taken less than a year later, marking the end of the war in Europe. In April of 1945, FDR died and Truman assumed the presidency. At this point, Japan hadn't been defeated in the West. The U.S. had secretly been working on the creation of atomic bombs. This was known as the Manhattan Project. Faced with the possibility of needing to invade Japan, Truman decided to drop one bomb on Hiroshima in Japan and another on Nagasaki a few days later. Japan surrendered immediately, but people soon started questioning the use of atomic bombs in war. A large part of the Allied victory were the technological advancements made during the war. Most notably, radar and sonar were integral in detecting other ships, planes, and even German U-boats. Of course, the discovery of nuclear fission was integral as well, as it paved the way for the atomic bomb. The makeup of the U.S. Army was very diverse. It featured every possible kind of American, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation. Although the Army was still segregated, military service provided women and minorities many opportunities for socioeconomic advancement. The U.S. emerged from World War II the most powerful nation on the planet. They and their fellow Allied powers were in charge of rebuilding the world. In 1945, the Big Three, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, met again at Yalta. They agreed to divide up Germany after the war into 4 zones, each to be controlled by an Allied power. Stalin also agreed to hold democratic elections in Poland after the war, but that never happened. Finally, in 1945, following the death of FDR, Truman, Stalin, and British Prime Minister Clement Attlee met in Potsdam. They planned the denazification of Germany, particularly the Nuremberg trials. At the Nuremberg trials, many Nazis were convicted of war crimes like the Holocaust and sentenced to death. Oh hi, didn't see you there. That was me in the video. My name is Ben. If you enjoyed the video and want to quiz yourself on the information, go to the OPA Education website, opaeducation.com. Sign up for the OPA free plan and take the Unit 7 quiz right now.